810 WBCK. Boy, you know, we've been hearing a lot in Michigan about water. That is to say, the water that comes out of our taps, in particular that in Flint, where they've had all of these problems. We talked to some extent anyway with the governor yesterday, and as much time as we had with him about that. But we really wanted to try and understand what this is all about. And so we turned to our local expert, Perry Hart, who is the utility administrator in the city of Battle Creek, to help us understand it. Perry, good morning.
Good morning, Rich.
Thanks for the time today.
You bet.
So when we turn on our water at the tap, where does that water come from?
The water source for the city of Battle Creek's water system is the Marshall Sandstone Aquifer, which we are accessing through a series of 22 wells up in the northeastern part of our community.
Wow.
The Verona Wellfield area.
Okay. And so the process for water from the aquifer to our tap is what? How does that work?
Well, it's withdrawn from the groundwater source. We run it through a multiple-step process through our iron removal facility that is nearing 20 years of age. That process removes a great deal of the iron and a few other constituents of the water. We then store it briefly in an underground reservoir and pump it out of our secondary building there, the Verona Pumping Station. Through that process, of course, there's a few steps of treatment that brings it to the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Mm-hmm. And this setup is, I presume, very typical of most cities, right?
Very much so. It's a filtration system using layers of anthracite and sand that trap the particles of iron and other items in the water. Mm-hmm. And then there's a process used where we can clean that sand and allow the water to flow through it, giving us a better product to serve to our customers.
All right. And this is an ongoing process that's monitored constantly, I presume.
Yeah, very much so. We take in the area of 60 samples every month. We do it on a weekly basis. Every Tuesday we have assigned and approved by the state sampling sites throughout the community and our neighboring townships that we supply water to.
All right. And when we come back in a minute, now that we understand how that works here locally, we'll talk about the Flint situation and how that situation sorted out to where it's been. It's gathered so many headlines, and how they're working on that situation. And that's coming up in just a moment on WBCK 812. 814 WBCK. Perry Hart is here, the utility administrator in the city of Battle Creek. We are talking about water. So we understand clearly, generally, how this works, but now this Flint situation, suddenly there were contaminants in the water, and trying to figure out where these come from. This must, when you hear these stories, it must really jar you.
Most definitely. I mean, in the state of Michigan, the water purveyors of the state all work together on providing, a safe product to their customers. So if you hear it anywhere in the state, or for that matter in the nation, the algae bloom of a couple summers ago was of concern.
Oh, right.
We all pay attention to it, yeah.
So how does this happen? I mean, generally speaking, when you find out that tap water isn't healthy, like that was the case in Flint, something's broken down somewhere, right?
Obviously. I can't speak firsthand of what has gone on in Flint, but yeah. I do have a reasonable understanding of what they've dealt with. They made moves in a cost savings manner to go away from the water supply that was being provided to them by the Detroit water system. Mm-hmm. That was a business decision, is my understanding. And in doing that, they switched back to a water source of the Flint River. Well, whenever you change your water source, of course, you're changing the chemistry of your water. You're taking water out of the river instead of Lake Huron.
Right.
Treatment techniques have to be altered. My understanding was they ended up having to increase disinfection processes, which led to some disinfection byproducts. And there is a process required in the lead and copper control, which is in the headlights right now, for corrosion control. It's a treatment of the water that protects the water from corroding the interior of water mains, service connections, and even the plumbing in homes. Prior to 1978, solder had lead in it.
Sure.
They have since decreased or eliminated lead in solder and made the plumbing inside homes safer. Even our metering process within Battle Creek, we're working through the process of removing any lead-containing water meters because they have an internal wetted surface that may contain lead. And in doing that process, in Flint, changing from one source water to another, there was some difficulties, evidently, in understanding the change in chemistry of the water, which made their water a little bit more corrosive to the piping and actually had lead and coppers leaching into the water system.
Wow.
But as was stated in many of the news articles, they can't define that that was the sole cause of the increased lead that they've discovered with the school children up in Flint.
Oh, boy.
It could have been a number. I mean, we've all heard about the lead-based paint on windowsills.
Sure.
That's another source for children.
Mm-hmm.
So the water industry does what we can to decrease the exposure to it.
We presume that that water system is under the same scrutiny that Battle Creeks and others are as far as monitoring and such, right?
Very similar. There are going to be slight differences based on the population served.
I see.
There's the DEQ, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality Water Sector, has regions set up throughout the state with engineers staffed at all those regions and environmental people and geologists that assist water operators and communities in maintaining water quality and meeting the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Some of the requirements of that act are regulated at different time frames for different size cities.
I see.
And, they kind of break it down into small non-community water systems, medium, which Battle Creek falls in. We're under the 50,000 population served by our water system. And then Flint, of course, would be over 50,000. So they get regulated just slightly different than us, but it's all the same set of rules.
Okay. And, the governor brought this up yesterday when we talked to him that, they're certainly going to investigate this thing, but there are so many factors because the water travels in so many places all the way to your tap. I mean, there could even be issues between the street and somebody's tap, and now we're talking about individual homes, if you can imagine, on blocks and blocks and blocks of streets and streets and streets all over that city. It's amazing.
Well, absolutely. And aged infrastructure doesn't just mean the publicly owned infrastructure in the right-of-ways. A lot of the lead and copper concerns that the water industry has dealt with since the mid-'80s, that is when the lead and copper rules were established and added to the Safe Drinking Water Act. A lot of that has the concerns of what is inside the home's plumbing and the service line going to the home.
Wow.
In the city of Battle Creek, the city owns up to the stop or the curb stop in the front yard, and then the property owner owns the service line to the home and all internal plumbing. All those things have to be taken into consideration when we're dealing with the lead and copper rule.
Right. Very interesting. We'll talk more about that in a moment on WBCK. We're talking with Perry Hart, Utility Administrator in the city of Battle Creek. Anyway, Perry Hart is here, and we're talking about water, Battle Creek Utility Administrator. And as you aptly pointed out a minute ago, beer is 98% water. Craft beer announcement there. We got to make sure our water is clean, right? So we can brew. Well, a little joke there, of course, but we want to make sure in all seriousness that water is clean. And even talking about the whole issue of monitoring for lead and other things, we do that here too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Through the lead and copper rule started in the mid-'80s. Late 80s and through the 90s, there was a lot of effort put out in monitoring and developing a treatment process that would protect the plumbing, water mains, fixtures in our homes from allowing lead or copper to be released into our water. And that process starts out with a chemical addition for treating the water that is then monitored and tested on a 6-month basis. Once you've met the requirements on that 6-month basis, you're put into a less stringent sampling procedure.
I see.
Where you're going every year. And then when we start seeing stabilized results that are below the action levels of the Safe Drinking Water Act, we go to reduced monitoring, where the city of Battle Creek has been since I joined here in 2008. We're required by the state to sample for lead and copper every 3 years, and this summer was the year we accomplished that sampling through our community.
And so that sampling is determined by virtue of, I suppose, process of elimination. You know what sort of homes need to be monitored more than others? Is that the way it's done?
Yeah, there are 3 different tiers of sampling sites that are defined by the lead and copper rule. We're fortunate here in Battle Creek. We were able to identify 33 sites that all fit into the Tier 1 category, which is what the state prefers. We didn't have to go to any Tier 2 or Tier 3 sites. And there's criteria laid out for what makes a good sampling site for the lead and copper rule. Age the home was built, type of copper involved, type of piping material in the city's portion of the service line, and the property owner's portion of the service line. All that has to be identified as these sites are chosen. And as I said, the 33 sites we have, this year we had a fantastic turnout. Take this opportunity to thank the 33 different homes that participated in this for us, because we got 100% of our samples back.
Oh, nice.
We were able to get them tested at the state lab up in Lansing, and we are in full compliance with the lead and copper requirements here in Battle Creek.
Okay, excellent. And of course, 33 homes, all of that is out of your control. You're expected to report the results there, but those folks are sampling their water for you, right?
Yeah, a lead and copper sample needs to be a sample that is provided as first draw. We want a sample of the water that is pulled out of the plumbing after it's sat overnight. So there's some rules that go out with the sampling procedure, or with the sample bottle, that define the procedure. We want to make sure that we're getting a sample that will properly represent reasonably fresh water. We want it to be a tap that's used regularly, not an outdoor faucet that gets used once a week to wash the car. But we want it to be a tap that's used regularly but has not been used for at least 6 hours, because that gives that water time to react with the plumbing. It gives you a better idea of what your treatment process is doing to protect the water from the metals.
Very interesting. Now, Perry, you talked about the infrastructure up to the curb, which is the cities, and then beyond that is the homeowner responsible for that. As far as the city portion of that, are municipalities generally under pressure to replace that infrastructure at some point?
As it's related to the lead and copper rule, part of that rule is you need to have a plan in place for replacing some of the lead lines. There's actually service lines in this community made out of lead. Now, our treatment techniques are very effective in protecting the water from such a service. We need to go down and repair those on occasion too, and it's kind of cool to look at the inside of that pipe to see how well protected it is. The interior of a lead service line pretty much looks like the day it went in. Very, very little reactivity with water that is properly treated, and I'm glad to say that the treatment process that was defined before I came into this office has done a marvelous job here in town and well protected.
All right. Well, then that helps us feel better about the way things are around here, and that we won't have to come up with some money in the immediate future, at least, to tear all that up and replace it. It's meant to last.
The treatment technique is in place, but we do have a process, as required by the rule, of replacing lead lines too, and that is being done through our street reconstruction project. Whenever you see a street that's closed off and we're tearing it up completely, that's utility replacement, and that utility replacement eliminates all lead in that block. So that's our replacement process, and that's been approved by the DEQ as part of our lead and copper rule.
And you do a little of that, every year or so?
Yes. We've got a budgeted amount that is funded both by street funds and by utility funds to replace utilities and reconstruct streets.
All right. Well, this has been very enlightening. We appreciate the time you've given us today, and it helps us understand the situation that's been going on across the state and here in our own neighborhoods. Thank you, Perry.
You are welcome.
Perry Hart, Director of Utilities, Utility Administrator with the City of Battle Creek. 820.